Oh, hi. I thought maybe we would get our learning on and learn a little bit about some economics. What do you think? In John Mishonis's large book, he's the author of your text. In the large one, the 24 chapter version of the same book, we use the 16 chapter. But in the 24 chapter, what he does is the chapter 12 that we have, which is the last one of this section, is on economics and politics, which are actually in his large book two separate chapters. So I thought that I was trying to think about which one would be best use of our time in class, and I thought that it'd probably be a much more interesting lecture or discussion for us to deal with politics in class. So what we're going to do here is deal with some of the major concepts of economics. So I'm going to explain a few of the big picture ideas, the kind of things that you're going to definitely want to know for a test and have an understanding of. That'll help you when you're reading this chapter, so that you are fully prepared for exam 3. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and start dealing with a few of these issues. I'm not going to lecture over the entire thing, over the entire chapter, but I definitely want to touch on some big picture ideas. All right, so let's talk a little bit about economics. And so this chapter is looking at one of those big institutions that the structural functionalists love to talk about, those big social structures that make up kind of these large organizational structures in society, and that are all interconnected with one another, and that help maintain society's stability and equilibrium. And so, okay, the first thing that we have to do, obviously, that we always do, is figure out what the heck we're even talking about, right? Defining terms. Nobody loves to define terms more than I do. I'm very nerdy about it. Okay, so first of all, when we talk about the economy, we discuss it as and define it as the social institution responsible for organizing the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. So let's unpack that just a little bit. One, it's a social institution, and it is so it's one of those big social structures that the structural functionalists talk about. And what does it do? What are its functions? Well, the functions are right there in our definition here, where it says that overseeing kind of the or organizing the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. That's what economy does. So producing goods and services, distributing goods and services, and consuming goods and services. Now, the the idea is that where does the concept of an economy or an economy come from? When did it happen? How did it happen? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a moment. What I want to do is preface it by saying that in order for us to be able to understand that, in order for it to make sense, we're going to have to talk about the different types of societies that exist in throughout kind of the human history. And that is a little outside of the text. They touch on it just a little bit, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail so it makes sense. But first, I wanted to say that the four factors that made the economy a distinct social institution, the things that kind of brought it about. One is having agricultural technology, and I'll talk about why that's important here in a few moments. But being able to use agricultural technology, the fact that jobs became specialized, meaning that people started doing very specific types of jobs, living in one place all year round instead of being nomadic, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. And then, of course, trade. And I'll explain why, how kind of trade came about and why that's important. All right, so next we're going to talk about the different types of societies. In order to understand the the origins of economics, where does it come from? The first thing that we have to do is look at kind of look back through history and very briefly kind of get a sense of where we kind of came from. All right, so in doing so, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the different types of societies throughout the human history. The first is we started off really as hunters and gatherers, meaning that that women would go out most of the time and gather fruits and vegetables and roots and things like that in order to be able to feed about to bring in about 85% of what the group ate. Men would go out and they would hunt. So the division of labor was really mainly based on the fact that when the females of the group would have children, that they would by necessity need to be near the young in order to be able to breastfeed. And so it was generally the men that went out and would hunt. Now, that wasn't always the case, but in most cases it was. And so there was that sort of division of labor, just basically based on necessity. But think about this. If you were someone who was a hunter and gatherer, and if you're a hunter and gatherer, you have to follow the herds around, which migrate in order to be able to eat, and so you have to hunt them in order to be able to catch them. Also, uh, sometimes you have to move around because you've run out of food. You've exhausted the food supply in a certain area, or you find a better food supply, or because the seasons change and you need to find a new food supply. So those groups were generally at least partly nomadic. And so they were able to move around quite a bit. That's how they had to follow the food. Now, if think about this, if you are someone who is nomadic, and and everything you own, you have to carry with you. How much extra stuff do you really want to carry with you? The answer generally is none. I mean, you don't want to carry anything more than what you absolutely have to carry, right? Well, yeah, that's absolutely true. And so, generally, hunters and gatherers traveled light. And so you didn't have a bunch of extra stuff. Now, the reason that'll become important is become obvious here in just a moment. What happened is that we learned that we moved transition from hunting and gathering to horticultural and pastoral societies. Now, horticulture is the idea of being able to raise small crops by hand using hand tools. So it's all human muscle power. And what we found is that our ancestors found is that certain seeds, if of the food that they would eat, could, if planted, would grow a new plant, and that was a revelation. And so over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, they figured out how to grow small crops. Pastoral societies are kind of go hand in hand with horticultural in that we learned that some of these large herd animals that we hunted could be domesticated, could be kept and grown, and we could grow our own food, and so we didn't have to chase them around. We could, in fact, grow them. We could raise them, is probably a better term, obviously. We could raise them, breed them, and have a food supply wherever we were at. That allowed us for the first time to be able to live in one place in permanent settlements all year round. And so we were able to live in these permanent things. This is where villages started to develop in its very earliest times. And so living in one place, living in a permanent settlement, living in a permanent structure allowed us for the first time in human history to be able to have more than what we needed. Think about that, more than what we needed. Because you're no longer having to carry everything with you, you have a place to store your extra stuff. Sometimes that's extra food, extra clothing, whatever. And of course, that then labor got divided up because some people then became farmers. Some people became people who made clothing. Some people became cobblers, right? They made shoes, and so on and so on and so on. So that allowed for not only for everyone to work together, but to have this what we call surplus. That's what we call it in economics. And all that means is surplus just means having more than what you need. And surplus, the extra, could be traded with other people. And they could, you could, so if you had extra grain, you could trade with a village up the road that has a bunch of extra clothing that you might need, or other things you could trade back and forth. And so that trade became bartering, and that is the beginnings of an economy. That's where economy started, was in horticultural and pastoral societies. After that, it just became more complicated. It just became more and more complex. But it's still economy. And then, of course, because it was difficult sometimes to, especially once trade got very sophisticated, people didn't want to have to take everything with them everywhere they went, all of their surplus. So we started using token economy. We started using coins, and then, of course, many years later, started using, paper because it was lighter and easier to carry. So that is, in essence, what an economy is. Now, when we moved to agriculture, from horticultural and pastoral to agriculture, what changed is, in an agricultural society, we started using animal power instead of just human muscle power to be able to do things like for pull a plow, for example, and that allowed for even larger crops, and then larger populations could be supported by that. And then we started seeing cities emerge and things like that. And agriculture we were that way for thousands of years. And then in about 1750 or so, the steam engine ended up changing everything and making it so that we could do a lot of work with this machine that used to be done either only by human muscle power or animal power. Up until then, everything that needed to be done had to be done by animal power, animal muscles, or human muscles. The steam engine changed all that, and later in internal combustion and everything else. So that was the Industrial Revolution around 1750 or so. That changed more and more trade, because it created mass production and then mass consumption. So that was the Industrial Revolution. And then, of course, what we live in now, that was brought on by the invention of the computer, and I argue also the internet, brought about what we call the post-industrial revolution. So, and of course, then everything becomes faster and faster and more connected. And money now, instead of having to be bartered, or things being, trading two pigs and a chicken for something that someone else has, we went to coins, which were kind of heavy, but then we went to paper money. Now we have electronic money. Now we have money moving around the planet at the speed of light. And so it's just levels of sophistication that's based upon the levels of technological innovation that we have, like what level our technological abilities are at. So that is kind of my not so short explanation of the different types of societies and how that comes about. So the main thing to keep in mind here is that when we got to horticultural and pastoral societies, that's when the concept of an economy was possible, because we had, for the first time in human history, we had surplus. The next thing we're going to talk about that's I think is pretty important that is definitely on a test on exam 3, because these are perfect types of test questions, and that's pretty important. It's just simply the three different types of sectors of the economy. The first is the primary sector. The second is the secondary sector, not surprisingly, and the third is the tertiary sector. No, I know that really is how it's pronounced. It doesn't look that way, but it is. The tertiary sector. So when these are each connected with different aspects of an economic system. So when we talk about a primary work sector, the easiest way to think about this is this is the generation of raw materials from the environment. What this means is that, quite simply, that if you're taking raw materials right from the environment and doing nothing with it, so uh, agriculture, logging, mining, right? So you're not doing it. You're not actually manufacturing it or making it into something. You're just drawing the raw materials right from the environment. That is the primary work sector. The secondary work sector is taking those raw materials that the primary sector uh, got and turning them into some kind of manufactured good. So taking uh, uh, wood and turning them into furniture. That's the secondary work sector. That's so manufacturing is a secondary work sector. The third is the tertiary work sector, and this is where you have an economy that generates services rather than goods. Excuse me. So in the tertiary work sector, what you have is focusing more on information than and moving money around. So like banking, uh, generating services. So the entire service industry, including everything from professors, doctors, lawyers, all the way down to servers at a restaurant, are all part of the service industry. You're not actually making a physical product like you would in manufacturing. Instead, what you're doing is you're generating services. You're creating services for people. The other part of the tertiary work sector are high-tech jobs where working with computers or some type of technology, where you're not creating it or generating it, but you're generating services using that technology. Okay, so these are the three work sectors: primary, secondary, and tertiary. It's not extraordinarily difficult, but it is something that I thought would benefit from a little bit of explanation. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is just talk a little bit about capitalism and socialism. Capitalism is an economic system where the natural resources and the means of producing goods and services is privately owned. What that means is that the natural resources, meaning the land, buildings, all the stuff that are the natural resources, also the means of producing goods and services, the businesses, they're all owned individually. Even if you even think about corporations are just owned by a bunch of individual people, right? Shareholders. So everything is owned privately, where you have private ownership of property, private ownership of business. And then you have the goal of a capitalist system is the pursuit of personal profit. You have everybody against everyone else in a competitive system where the consumer is king or queen, trying to compete for jobs and money and other resources, land, everything. So now a competitive system has the benefit of really being very productive, meaning that people who are competing. It seems that it's kind of a natural thing for human beings to try to strive for better because they think they're going to personally get something out of it. They're going to get the raise, or they're going to get a better job, or they're going to get a bigger house, or whatever, more stuff. And that really is the goal of capitalism. The goal of capitalism is everybody competing in order for everyone to ideally reach whatever their full potential is. Uh, that being said, does a capitalist system really do that? And actually, what Marx argued, and he turned out to be correct about this, is that at least in the form of capitalism we have today, what we've seen is a small number of people up at the top run away with all the money and all of the stuff, and they do that at the expense of the majority. Now, capitalism can be a very good and very productive system, which with a much higher standard of living than, say, socialism, which is what we'll talk about next. But it does have its downside too. It's very cutthroat and very competitive at its worst. And at its best, it really frees people up to be creative and entrepreneurial and to be able to do all kinds of really amazing things sometimes. So that's capitalism. Now, understand that there are no pure forms of capitalism and socialism in the real world. What we're talking about is capitalism in theory. In theory, the theoretical version of capitalism, the sort of pure version of capitalism, is a system where um, everything is private. Everything is privatized. Everything is for profit. We don't actually, even we in America, who are we think of ourselves as kind of dyed-in-the-wool capitalists. We don't have that kind of system. So that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that with capitalism is that capitalism is the majority of many of the countries have a capitalist economic system, but what they end up with is extensive use of socialist kind of institutions within that, or socialist kind of a socialist uh, safety net. And so let's talk a little bit about what socialism is. Whereas capitalism is the pursuit of personal profit and where everything is privately owned, a socialist system, in its pure form, is an economic system where the natural resources and the means of producing goods and services are collectively owned. What we mean by that is that they're owned by the people, by everyone in the society. Uh, Now, the way that really plays out is that everybody sort of shares, but not necessarily perfectly equally. But the goal is in a socialist system is for people to make everybody more or less middle class, especially in its purest form. So everybody has a kind of a more or less a middle class lifestyle. Uh, and so everybody can afford things. Nobody's going to be super, super, super rich, and nobody's going to be homeless or living in abject poverty. Everybody is more or less middle class. Nobody's going to be homeless because everybody's provided with a place to live. Everybody's provided with a job. Every able-bodied person can has a job there for them. Um, and what you have is some distinct features, which is a collective ownership of property. Uh, it also means that when we say the means of producing goods and services are collectively owned, what we mean by that is that even the businesses are collectively owned. The factories and the buildings, everything is owned by the people and run by individual people, a bunch of individuals, but who are working at a set salary that's set by the government, right? Because in this type of system where everybody's sharing everything, everybody owns everything, what you have to have is a government system that is very large, very bureaucratic, and allocates resources based upon need, not based upon competition. So, say if you were young, like many of you are, and you just you don't need a huge place because you haven't gotten married or you don't have kids yet, you would be provided with maybe a small apartment. But over time, say you get married and you have a couple of kids, maybe you need a much larger apartment, or maybe you even need a townhouse or a condo or even a house. That would be provided for you based upon what your needs are. So if you had a big family, you would obviously need a house. Uh, and so that would be allocated, decided by the government system. Also, the means of producing goods and services, meaning all the businesses. So that means that the economy itself is actually run by the government. So not only does the government control all the businesses, decide what products are made and things like that, but it also sets prices in order for you to be able to afford your eggs and your gas and stuff and have a kind of a middle class lifestyle. Then on top of that, your salary, how much money you make, is set by the government in your job. So that way, kind of, it all gets controlled so that everybody can be more or less middle class. That doesn't mean that everyone's perfectly equal. It means that there's a much flatter system. Remember when we talked about stratification? It's a much flatter system than, say, a very stratified system like capitalism, where you have very, very rich people and very, very poor people, and so the distance between the wealthiest people and the poorest people is huge. Right? You don't see that in a socialist system. Now, let me explain now that there are no pure versions of capitalism and no pure versions of socialism that even exist out there. What we have instead is hybrids of the two. For example, we think of ourselves as capitalists. If somebody were to ask you if you're a capitalist, you would say, "Yeah, I'm a capitalist," and that's more or less true. But you also benefit from many, many different types of socialist programs. For example, public education is socialism. Uh, Medicare, Medicaid, socialism. Public pension systems like Social Security, socialism. Right? These things are all socialistic, and so you have, for example, but then you have countries that have even more social programs. So they have things like universal health care, single payer systems where everybody pays into taxes and everybody gets to be covered, and people pay based upon how much they can afford to pay. And so poorer people pay less. Well, people, the better off you do, the more you pay a little more. But everybody gets a card that they can take to the doctor or to take their kids to the doctor whenever they're sick. Uh, Many of the capitalist economic systems in Europe, some of those all the other high income nations, not only do they all have universal health care, but many of them have universal free college. Well, free meaning that it's paid for out of taxes. Everybody pays into it, and then that's paid for out of that. Doesn't mean that everybody gets to go to college, but if you do get in, which many many people do, it means that you don't have to pay for it. You don't have to go into debt in order to do this. These are some of the actually some of the programs that Bernie Sanders has been pushing forward as a politician. He's been saying, look, all these other countries do this. All the other high income nations have a lot of these programs. We should have these programs too. Many, many people would benefit from them, and we would have a better economy because we would be able to, that we wouldn't have as many people sick because they could go to the doctor when they had the sniffles instead of having to go to the doctor when they had pneumonia. People wouldn't have to choose between paying their rent or going to the doctor. People wouldn't have to consider, come out of college, 30, 40, 50, $150,000 in debt sometimes, and spend the next 20 to 30 years paying it off. On those high ends, you can end up paying for it for years and years and years, and then only then after you get all that paid off, then you have some disposable income. Then you can actually start saving for retirement, but you've gone, maybe 10, 20, 30 years into your careers before you even get it all paid off. Uh, what he's saying is, somebody like Bernie Sanders is saying, is that is not a good way to run an economy, because we need people out there who can come right out of college and start making money and start spending money and start being able to pay into taxes and do all the other things that'll help make the economy strong. So that's his view. I mean, whether you agree with it or don't agree with it, that's what he's saying. So when they call him a democratic socialist, what they're saying is that he's believes in democracy, but he believes in having a basic market system, like we have a free market system, except not totally free. meaning that you have a lot of regulation by the government saying, look, everybody's got to play by rules. You can't just, these corporations can't just do whatever they want. So a lot of that is controlled. They can't pollute as much as they want, or they can't decide that they're going to pay people really, really low wages. So that part of that would be like, raising up the minimum wage. That again is socialism. It's a way of forcing businesses to be able to, especially big businesses, to be able to, when they who can afford to pay that, making them pay it. And so that the goal is that that's going to help everyone, not just the few up at the very top of the pyramid, who are going to benefit from low wages. So that's socialism and capitalism. They're not extremely complicated, but I found that so many students misunderstand what socialism is, and really misunderstand what capitalism is. And so uh, the thing that you need to keep in mind is to kind of keep these things straight, because there will be at least probably a question of each on the test. And so I thought it would be helpful to clarify what those things are so that you'd have a good understanding of it. Thank you very much for your time, and have yourself a good day.